This is a geopolitical power tier list, and we're focusing on countries where their influence is constrained more or less to the continent or the general region where they're located. So we're going to break down and place in a tier list these countries that aren't quite on the level of the USA and China and Russia and entities like that, ones that are a little bit smaller, but still worth paying attention to and ranking. The first country we're covering is Argentina. I think that overall Javier Milei is going to be a really positive change for the country, the economic outcomes of Argentinians. Today, they have very little economic might to exert very far into South America. They don't really have much of a military to speak of. The GDP per capita is just $14,000. And then really just from a geography standpoint, what we covered in that video is that they're basically safe from outside intervention because of how far away they are from Europe, from the United States, from these other places. And they have the Andes Mountains on one of their borders. But that same thing makes it really hard for them to project power even into their immediate neighbors. Yes, Buenos Aires is very influential in Uruguay. But you think about these countries, most of them want secure, solid, stable countries on their border because that's going to help them be stable, not have to take in refugees, not have to deal with crime. And we just had an attempted coup in Bolivia, right on Argentina's back door. They're not even able to stabilize their half of the South American continent. And really, Brazil, it sees themselves as the superpower of South America. So they're the ones that are going to go in when there's strife in Venezuela. Brazil wants to be the arbiter of that. Argentina isn't really close to having a say at the table for all these other countries in the region. They still really have to fix what's going on at home. So D tier for Argentina. The next country is Poland. They're a NATO member, and they share a border with both Russia and Belarus. They've been incredibly instrumental in supplying Ukrainian troops with equipment and gear during the war in Ukraine. And they are the pivot point. If you want to talk about a scenario where the Ukraine war goes from a small conflict really situated in one country to, the Third World War scenario or a war that drags in the entirety of Europe, Poland is that pivot point. And they have been investing heavily in advance of this scenario into their military. And doing research for this video, I didn't realize that they were actually not only the 7th largest economy in the entire EU, but the largest in Central Europe. This is a meaningful economy within the context of the European Economic Union and a real military domino. Russia does not have the sense, the belief that they can just march into Poland. Not that marching into Ukraine has gone particularly well, but they have no belief or faith that that is going to be some straightforward or easy fight. Whereas all the indications when Putin went into Ukraine, he was like, I think that this should be something of a cakewalk and a straightforward endeavor for us. It hasn't ended up that way, but Poland has done much, much more to defend themselves in addition to being connected to the NATO alliance. So we're putting Poland on the B tier. Next, we're going to Indonesia. This archipelago, 17,000 islands, has considerable defensibility because how the heck are you going to even conquer a couple thousand islands, let alone 17,000 of them, without an enormous naval and maritime expedition? They're not right immediately situated on China's coast. They could call upon allies or pull in outside forces if necessary, if they really were in any sort of dire straits. But speaking of straits, look at that. They are one of the entities that can shut down the Strait of Malacca. Now, some folks say that like a China-Taiwan scenario really just comes down to the Strait of Malacca. That's just going to get shut down and like China's going to collapse. I don't really buy that. I think they have other avenues to potentially secure their energy needs. It's not like they have that big of a point of leverage on China. However, it is still an important corridor. And there's other corridors that go through other parts of Indonesia that are essential maritime trade routes. All of the value that's on the open seas traveling through Indonesian waters at some point in time. That GDP that they've grown has actually outgrown their Belt and Road Initiative loans. So there's a lot of Belt and Road countries that are underwater on their loans, and it's a form of debt diplomacy that locks people into someone's network. Indonesia can still kind of push back on China because of the growth that they've experienced from their different infrastructure investments. A big part of that is their control of nickel and the fact that they have a young demographic. They're not one of these aging demographics. They have the workers to go apply to these different industries. And overall, they're in the neighborhood of like the 16th biggest economy right now. There's a pathway for them being in the top 10 economies within a decade or two. So that is going to translate into even more geopolitical might in the future. But even today, as purely a regional player within Southeast Asia, we are putting Indonesia on the A tier. Now, when I say that, you may flinch, you may hesitate and be like, dude, A tier, like where's India, where's the US? I made a completely separate video that covers major geopolitical powers, the folks that really can exert influence into multiple corners of the globe. And so go watch that video if that's what you're looking for here. We're really talking about regional influence. So an A tier here is really like a D or an E tier in the context of that other video. You can watch them together and then roast me in the comments because I'm sure you're going to disagree with something. Next up is South Africa. And we could say right off the bat, this is a smaller economy than Argentina's. They have similar domestic issues that they need to resolve first. But the difference is that there really is no regional hegemon with an intense focus on the greater South African region. Now, absolutely, there is all sorts of meddling in places like the Congo and some of these other resource-rich countries by outside parties, the US and China being two of the biggest, Russia as well. So we're going to put them at the C tier, but they do have, at a regional level, considerably more influence. Next up is Israel. Israel can clearly do some diplomacy and exert some influence in other corners of the globe. Israel is in such a need for a defensive posture that they're still coming to these other countries looking for assistance, almost exclusively in the context of their interests within the Middle East. They have elite military technology because of that diplomacy. They have the Iron Dome, the ability to do precision strikes, one of the world's best intelligence organizations. And on the flip side, some of the toughest geography, like in terms of defensibility, they have very tight lines if they're on a multi-front war, but like, man, they are kind of pinned down against the sea. And I'm not trying to use that analogy lightly. I know that carries a lot of weight. I'm putting them at the S tier because it's really hard as we go through all these other countries to conceive of a country that has the capacity and the willingness to actually execute assassinations of leaders of their explicit enemies. In terms of regional power projection, this is a very capable regional power. So Israel gets the S tier for that reason. Next up, we've got Taiwan. And this is one of the trickiest ones because in a vacuum, there isn't enough hard power there to really project any power onto its neighbors, right? Japan, China, in the same neighborhood. You can only be so powerful when those are your immediate neighbors. However, because of the desire by China to acquire or reacquire, however you want to try to define their desire to bring Taiwan back into the PRC, because of that, you've got really powerful allies in Japan and the United States. It's all because of TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And because that is so essential to global supply chains, to the entire kind of technology boom that we've been riding here for the last couple decades, they have enormously powerful friends. And that means investment, that means access to the most advanced military equipment. And so for that reason, I have to put them on the A tier, even though they've got some really scary neighbors right across the Taiwan Strait. Next up is Pakistan. Pakistan has nukes. There are only 9 countries with nuclear weapons. And it's really, really hard for me to put anyone with a nuclear arsenal low on this tier list, right? They are pinned down by some very powerful neighbors. And at the same time, enormous political and economic instability. They have not had a single prime minister make it through an entire term since the partition of India. There's not a lot of political stability. The economy is heavily indebted, but at the same time, enormous young population, weapons that make them basically uninvadable by those neighbors. And so for that reason, we have to put them at the B tier. They're definitely not making anyone near them do what they want, but no one's going to mess with them either. So I think that that's basically where we're leveling out at for B tier countries. Iran is wild because we literally just said that Israel is S tier. And so you couldn't possibly put Iran on the S tier also. Iran is really challenging here. They basically are either going to go on the S or the A tier. They are enormously influential across the region, right? And they do this through, now that they can sell oil, through funding different proxies to go prosecute the conflicts that benefit them. So the civil war that's been going on in Yemen, and simultaneously you have everything going on in Israel with Hezbollah and Hamas right now. That is an incredible amount of influence and power at a regional level. And they have an enormous military and a considerable economy. They are able to export oil. They control the Strait of Hormuz. I was going to put them in the A tier, but as I'm talking it through now, I don't think I can put them at the A tier. I think it's S tier as well for Iran. North Korea is next. They have a nuclear arsenal. They do not have a strong economy. They have a tight alliance with China. but they're largely economically isolated. So I put them at the B tier because you can't drop them lower than that, but they're nowhere close to A tier in terms of influence. Their GDP per capita is so low that it makes you sad when you really think in the context of what citizens of that country have to go through. So going to move on before I get too sad. Spain, similarly, in the EU, NATO member, really big economy, but the Western Mediterranean, there just isn't as much going on there. Like, they're not really that major of a player there. They're kind of sleepy. Like, I think in the analogy of a book like Douglas Murray's The Strange Death of Europe, or just general, like, the malaise that I think a lot of people have applied to Europe over the last 30 years or so, I think Spain epitomizes that. I'm going to put them at the B tier. I'm sure we'll get some hate in the comments for that, considering the difference, but this is my video, not yours. Next, we're going to Greece. I think Greece epitomizes the question here. They can project a little bit of power into the Balkans, but they are surrounded by a bunch of substantial players. We've got Italy, Egypt, we've got Israel, we've got Turkey, we've got Russia, kind of all trading around the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. At best, they're peers to some of these entities, but they have, 1/8 the population and 1/5 of the GDP of Turkey. That is their primary kind of geopolitical problem to solve, so to speak. Despite being in the EU and in NATO, Turkey's been very effective at boxing them out in terms of just hard and soft geopolitical power. They're going at the D tier here. They have their own issues at an economic level. Beautiful place. I've visited, wonderful tourism industry, but outside of that, it is not one that I think is on an upward trajectory, nor can project much power into its region generally. Similarly, we've got Egypt right across the Mediterranean. We're pushing them in the C tier just because the Suez Canal is it is the important artery of global trade for an entire hemisphere. We saw when that big boat crash that got shut down, we saw the kind of reverberations there. And not that Egypt is particularly active in, shutting that down or exerting some crazy toll, but it is really influential in both the Middle East and North African affairs, and it has a very large population and military. If its economy was stronger, you could see it projecting outwards more, but I don't think those economic issues are going to go away anytime soon. So we'll place it at the C tier, probably the back of the C tier, closer to the D tier level, but C tier nonetheless. Next, we're on to the Netherlands, and this is probably the most commented critique of my video ranking U.S. allies in a tier list, that I overlooked the Netherlands, and the commenters were right. ASML is another, similar to TSMC in Taiwan, enormously geostrategically important company because they make the machines that make the semiconductors that are made in Taiwan, amongst other places. Their lithography machines are what actually make all the semiconductors that are so important in Taiwan. And so when they joined the US and Japan in banning the export of these devices into China, that was a major geopolitical domino. And some people are super bearish on that. They think that that's just going to unleash Chinese innovation and they're going to have this whole semiconductor industry spun up in a few years, or that there's ways around the sanctions that are kind of being skirted and China's still getting access to those machines. I really do think that it chokes off the Chinese semiconductor industry in a meaningful way and slows it down for 3 to 5 years. I'm not technically sophisticated enough to have a more precise answer than that. It is a very large economy for being a relatively small population, and they do have these partners that can make things happen for them. Like, that is a real negotiating chip when you have a company like ASML that is so systemically important within your country. Really high GDP per capita. There's US nuclear weapons stationed there, and they have a really important port. Rotterdam is one of the more important ports in all of Europe. So for that reason, we're putting them on the A tier, probably on the lower end of the A tier, but an A tier country nonetheless. Thank you for all the people that left me mean comments on that other video. We're going to go quick on Belgium, putting them at the C tier. They are in the EU. They are in NATO. Strong economy, but like small in the context of the EU. The crazy thing, and why I'm kind of bearish on the EU generally, is that any member country can veto any sort of policy being moved forward. And so when you have that one vote, you do have regional political power through the ability to use your veto. And Belgium hasn't used that. They haven't needed to use that necessarily. But you've seen other countries, Hungary, Slovenia, places like that, use their veto to exert real power and extract concessions. So Belgium has that capability, putting them also at the bottom of the C tier. I feel like all the C tier countries have basically said put at the bottom of the C tier, other than Egypt, Or I even did that with Egypt, didn't I? United Arab Emirates is next. Significant oil wealth and a strategic location in the Persian Gulf. And growing, when we think in terms of regional power, diplomatic influence. They were involved in the Abraham Accords. That is the beginning of a potential counter-alliance to Iran in the form of Saudi Arabia and Israel being the two primary entities, but UAE really providing a lot of potential financial support for such an endeavor. So we are putting them at the A tier. They also, I believe, own multiple sporting franchises in Europe. Not that that's hard power in any way, shape, or form, but it'll bring some soft power benefits and some profits their way. Belarus, despite having some natural resources that the world needs, and it is a real trading chip, is so closely aligned to Russia and so reliant upon Russia for its security that we have to put it at the D tier. It really doesn't even have a lot of kind of policy sovereignty. You know, Lukashenko's had some, you could say, contested elections, if you want to even call it that. I think that might be a little bit gracious, is really, kind of constrained to being a vassal state of Russia. So we're putting them at the D tier, highly economically dependent on Russia, not a very large population, but because of the military bases, the proximity to Poland and to Ukraine, still definitely influential within the context of their region. New Zealand, we're also putting on the D tier. They are part of the Five Eyes intelligence network. This is really kind of more like the Argentina argument where, like, who are they even going to be near and influence? Australia? Like, maybe they influence Australia a little bit, but they can't really hold a candle to Australia's geopolitical might and economy. And other than that, it's like some islands in the Pacific. Who really cares? So next we've got Nigeria, which is the largest economy in Africa. Huge population, young population, a lot of potential there, and recent oil wealth that they're trying to translate into a more comprehensive economic uprising. However, there's kind of signals that there may be something like the resource curse here, struggles with development outside the context of some of those natural resources that are found in Nigeria. They've got these neighbors that are all either struggling with stability or economic development in some way, shape, or form. So on a relative basis, within their little sphere in the Sahel, they do have some regional influence that is significant. Because of that, we're going to drop them on the C tier. It's really limited in scope because of the kind of domestic issues that are still being managed there. Next, we've got Norway. They have a really high GDP per capita, strategic location in the context of the Arctic Circle, and are a part of NATO, oil and gas reserves. A lot of kind of good fundamentals here. We kind of come back to that question of, like, who are you even going to influence, right? They're not in the EU, so they don't have that veto vote within the context of EU politics. And then in the Nordic countries, they're all allied, but there's not a ton of force or influence that can be exerted that way. They are insulated from Russia, so they're not really that particularly physically threatened, but they just don't have a ton of capacity to influence externally by the nature of geography, kind of off on their own there. So I'm leaving them on the D tier. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Switzerland, we're given the C tier. It is a global financial hub, and that neutrality gives it kind of diplomatic capability, the ability to influence, the ability to talk to a lot of different entities to get things done, and that's a really valid form of soft power. They also have a high defense budget relative to their size and super defensible terrain. Part of the reason for the origins of Switzerland neutrality is that it's just really hard to navigate internally relative to a lot of these other European countries. So folks might pass through, but more likely they're just going to go around Switzerland and get to the stuff that they really want because it isn't necessarily the prize to be had. So for that reason, we're going to drop them on the C tier. I can't give them the same level of influence as, a nuclear armed country, despite the fact that they're far richer than them. It gives them a ton of soft power to influence the region and to kind of always have a seat at the table when it comes to some power politics. Denmark, just like Belgium, has the EU veto and a relatively strong GDP per capita, so we're putting them at the C tier. Moving on to Ethiopia, it is the fastest growing economy in Africa, but it is really kind of broken apart by internal conflicts. They certainly can project a little bit of power into Sudan or Somalia, but there's not even a particularly big reward there when they get their act together. If you're going to have that civil strife, we can't put you above D tier. And finally, we have Qatar or Qatar. I don't know. There's enormous gas reserves, enormous oil reserves. They do have that strategic location in the Persian Gulf. They would be superseded by Iran if things really came to blows there, but they do host a huge U.S. military base. The Al Jazeera network that they fund is an enormous vehicle for soft power. And similarly to the UAE, they are involved in major international sporting endeavors like the 2022 FIFA World Cup, and they own Paris Saint-Germain. So they have these soft power elements and they have such phenomenal wealth. I think they really punch above their weight. I've even seen stuff about them, basically paying off some of the debts of Egypt in order to have greater influence there. I'm going to put them at the B tier because they have more outward power projection capabilities despite that small population. Everything is paid for, taken care of at home. That allows them to look outward. They don't have those domestic issues that some of those C-tier countries are juggling. That was my tier list. Let me know in the comments what you hated, loved, were interested in, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.